Good evening and welcome to tonight's special program sponsored by the Graduate School of Journalism, the San Francisco Chronicle Herb Caen Lecture Series in collaboration with the Commonwealth Club. I'm Phil Bronstein. I'm the editor of the Chronicle. Thank you for coming. We're honored to be part of this series that bears the name of Herb Caen because Herb embodied in his column for over half a century the character and personality of the San Francisco Bay Area, which we believe modestly, of course, is the best place in the world. Yeah, you can applaud your own. Even in Berkeley, you know, it's okay to do that, especially in Berkeley. Like Herb, the region has its brilliance and its controversy and its unique creativity, entrepreneurship, and, of course, its warts. It's kind of like the best journalism. I doubt anyone in this room believes that great journalism is without warts, is immaculate, is flawless, because it's not. But the best journalism, as they say, does speak truth to power. And the more powerful the institutions and the more forcefully those institutions wield that power, the more essential good journalism is to a vibrant culture. Today, as it has been in the past. We're particularly delighted that tonight's event features an iconic network anchorman, a veteran of a time when network anchormen, and yes, they were all men, helped make us an informed citizenry every night of the week. Dan Rather is without any doubt, in addition to being a legendary anchor, also a very serious journalist. It's not always true of TV anchors. There's controversy that swirls around him, as it does around all interesting and notable people. In his case, a CBS News report on the Air National Guard about a year and a half ago, which I'm sure will get addressed tonight. But that certainly doesn't detract from his many, many accomplishments. The truth is, most relentless journalists are embroiled in some kind of controversy in their careers. In fact, Dan was the last of the great anchors in the news anchor period of our cultural history. Back in the days when the movie Network, with its psychics and its ranting nutjobs, was really a parody and not a reality. Dan's decades in the most important chair at the respected Tiffany Network, CBS, came in between the tenure of the most trusted man in America then and America's sweetheart. Not my wording, by the way. With due respect to Mr. Cronkite, one can ask the question, why was Walter Cronkite trusted? Was he smarter than everyone else? Was he more honest as a person? Maybe. I don't know the answer to that. And I suspect the public that trusted him so profoundly doesn't either. He just conveyed this great sense of being the trustworthy uncle you never had. Dan Rather, on the other hand, has been truly field-tested in the crucible of journalism, from Afghanistan to the White House. These days, if you tick off the President of the United States, you get your seat assignment in the briefing room changed, or you lose, access. Dan Rather, as a White House reporter, aggressively went after the paragon of complex psychopathology, Richard Nixon. Nixon had an enemies list that was local, it was not international, it was people, not countries. And he wiretapped or tried to wiretap and burgled and God knows what else, people he didn't like. So that's hardly a new thing. Dan Rather also sat right in the lair of Saddam Hussein just before the start of the U.S. invasion and asked him very tough questions. Whatever it may have seemed like in your living rooms as you were watching it, that was a dangerous place to be, where neither the sanctimony of journalism nor the embassy of your country of origin is going to help you if suddenly his bodyguard decides to pull out a gun and shoot you in the head for committing disrespect. Dan is a journalist of the old school, and I'm really looking forward to hearing him address the new media, the new technology of citizen journalism and blogs and podcasts, because so far as I've been able to tell, no one really knows the answer to the new technology question, which is, what is the frequency? But Dan does have, and always has had, in the many years I watched him on television, that thing that used to get a lot of heat back in the days of, traditional journalism, but in the contemporary universe of blogs has gained great popularity, as I think it should. Dan has personality. Now, officially, I want to remind you there are question cards on your seats for tonight's distinguished speaker, and they'll be collected during the program. We're also recording this event for later broadcast on the Commonwealth Club Radio Network, so please make sure that your cell phones and beepers and blogs and everything else are turned off. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Joe Epstein, member of the Commonwealth Club's Board of Governors, who will open tonight's program for radio. Thanks very much. Have a good time.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's program with journalist Dan Rather, brought to you from Wheeler Auditorium on the campus of the University of California, Berkeley. This program is co-sponsored by the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism and the San Francisco Chronicle Herb Caen Lecture Series in collaboration with the Commonwealth Club of California. I am Joe Epstein, a past president of the Commonwealth Club, a member of the club's Board of Governors, and your chair for this evening. We also welcome the listeners of the Commonwealth Club Radio Network. Tonight we are pleased to have as our distinguished guest famed broadcast journalist Dan Rather, who will be in conversation with Orville Schell, Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley. But before I turn the program over to Dean Schell, let me give just a few biographical details about each of tonight's participants. Dan Rather completed his final broadcast on the CBS Evening News on March 9th, 2005, after serving as its anchor and managing editor for 24 years. He is still a correspondent for the CBS News magazine, 60 Minutes. Since 1962, when Rather first joined CBS News, he has handled some of the most challenging assignments in journalism, including serving as CBS News bureau chief in London and Saigon, as well as White House correspondent during the Johnson and Nixon administrations. In recent years, while anchor, he has been on the ground in such locales as Iraq, Kuwait, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. Mr. Rather's career has also included the most sought-after interview in the world, an exclusive one-on-one interview with Saddam Hussein before the current Iraq War, and the first interview with President Clinton following the Lewinsky scandal and Clinton's impeachment. From the assassination of John F. Kennedy to Beijing, Bosnia, Haiti, and Hong Kong decades later, Dan Rather has covered most of the world's major news stories, and in the process, he has received virtually every major award in broadcast journalism, including numerous Emmys and Peabodys. When Mr. Rather reported on the Houston floods at the start of his career, more than 45 years ago, Walter Cronkite admired the fact that Dan Rather was, and I quote, up to his rear end in water moccasins. And perhaps that is a metaphor for much of his career. Orville Schell has been the dean of the University of California Graduate School of Journalism for the past decade. He holds a bachelor's degree from Harvard University and did his PhD work in Chinese history right here at UC Berkeley. He is a noted scholar on China, the author of 14 books, and a highly respected journalist, whose work appears in magazines such as The New Yorker and The Atlantic. He has also been a contributor to the PBS series Frontline and 60 Minutes. And now, please give a very warm welcome to Dan Rather and Dean Orville Schell.
Well, Dan, let me start off by thanking you for coming all this way to the sun-kissed coast to share your thoughts, and I'm sure you have many. It's probably a perfect time in your life to reflect a bit on a long, long career. Maybe we should start in Texas. And I've often wondered, Texas seems to produce an incredibly curiously how to put it, varied group of people. And I wonder, what did you take out of Texas? I mean, when you moved to New York, what part of you is still a Texan?
Well, every part of me is still a Texan. That I'm not sure I originated the phrase. It's become popular in recent years, but I've said all my life that I was Texas born, Texas bred, and when I die, I'll be Texas dead. That growing up in Texas, when I did, which was during the Depression and during World War II, those were my childhood days, Texas was far less urban than it is today. It was mostly agriculture-based. And one grew up with a very strong sense of the land. You cannot understand Texas or Texans without understanding how strong the tie is to the land. But with that, it's an immense place, as Texans are fond of reminding everyone, with big sky and a lot of open spaces. And I'm trying to address your question that while you feel this very, very real tie to the land, that you do also dream of faraway places with strange-sounding names.
Like
Texas,
New York?
New York, Shanghai, London, Paris. And I think in my own case that I know as what Winston Churchill called the gathering storm was covered on American radio. My father, who did not finish high school, in fact, I'm not even sure he started high school, worked with his back and his hands all his life. He was basically a laborer. But he had a terrific interest in newspapers. Not since have I seen anyone who was an avid reader of newspapers as my father. And so I think in my own case that contributed to the sense of the world affairs. He and my Uncle John, who's now deceased as well, would argue about Hitler's Mein Kampf, for example, when it came out, whether America should enter the war, whether we should support Britain. So as a very young child, I heard those conversations, and that added to what I think is a general sense with Texans, whether you speak of Jim Lehrer or Walter Cronkite or Bob Schieffer, a long list of journalists. I think somewhere in that, the strong sense of place, you cannot grow up in Texas without having a strong sense of place. And with that, companion of that, of dreaming of these faraway places, is somewhere in that is the seed of the reason that you have so many people who go into journalism. It's also true that because Texas, particularly during the 30s and 40s and even into the early 50s, it's large geographically, and there are a lot of newspapers and a lot of radio stations, now television stations as well. Point is, there are a lot of places for journalists to start in Texas, perhaps more than most other places. I wouldn't want to say more than California, but an awful lot. And so if you aspire to be a journalist or think you aspire to be a journalist, you may be able to get a handhold, a beginning job, a little easier there than other places, and I think that also contributes to it.
Sometimes if you scratch a transplanted New Yorker a little bit, you very often find people who somehow feel that they're masquerading somehow. They're never quite comfortable with the big city life. They never quite become New Yorkers. And I wondered if you feel that you did become a New Yorker or whether you always had that slight aloofness from...
No, in the very beginning, New York can be overwhelming, and in many ways is overwhelming despite your best efforts. But particularly since 9/11, I felt very strongly that I'm a New Yorker. You say, well, I thought you said you were a Texan, and that's true. But I've lived in New York as my main home. We've kept a home in Texas always. My wife, Jean, is also a Texan. We've always had a place in Texas. But we've lived in New York, well, for the whole 24 years that I was anchor and managing editor of the Evening News. Basically, we've lived there for, more than 35 years. Is that correct? Yeah, no, more than 27 years it would be. But nonetheless, I love New York. I love the people of New York. And as I say, particularly since 9/11, it's deep in my marrow.
What did you imagine that being a journalist was all about when you began? I mean, what was it that sort of got encoded on your DNA at that point of beginning?
Well, the first thing I said, my father was an avid newspaper reader. And that was the main thing that got me interested in newspapers. And I'm very lucky, and I recognize that, because I've always wanted to be a reporter. When we played those games as children, sometimes other children want to be an airplane pilot, as we called it in those days, or an Indian chief or something. I always said I wanted to be a reporter. And I said that before I really knew what a reporter was. And I think it was because that my father, we had newspapers all over the house, newspapers were discussed. My father would throw newspapers against the wall when he didn't like an editorial. And he would tell my mother.
A liberal or a conservative?
He was independent. If he were alive in here, he would say, I'm an American. Mm-hmm. But I think somehow, when I look back, why did I always say I want to be a reporter? It has to be because my father and my mother was also a pretty avid newspaper reader, but I really didn't know what it meant. And I can remember, I wrote about this somewhere, when I first saw a live walking reporter, a boy that I didn't know well, but it was in our rough neighborhood, had drowned in Buffalo Bayou, which runs through Houston. And the police cars came out, and the fire rescue group came out, and somebody said, there's a reporter over there. And I went over to get a look at him. And, he had a notebook, and that was the first of it. But in my time and place, Orville, being a reporter, the most you could dream, and my biggest dream for a long time, which I thought was unachievable, was to become a big byline reporter for one of our 3 local newspapers, the Houston Chronicle, Houston Post, Houston Press. 2 of those, unfortunately, are gone now. So as I got older, and I kept saying, I want to be a reporter, I want to work for a newspaper, being a reporter in that time and place basically meant aspiring to be a newspaper man, and that's what I aspired to be. And being...
And what did that mean to you? I mean, what did you imagine was so exciting about that? Or perhaps put it a different way, how would you describe in 3 or 4 sentences what it means to be a reporter now?
Well, in the answer to the first part of that question, as I got a little older and began thinking about being a reporter, it was to be part of something bigger than yourself, and perhaps maybe be in a position to make some small, perhaps some wee small contribution. That was it. Now, what it means to be a reporter is to be interested in people and stories, and to be basically a storyteller about people and events. In simplest and most important form, I think that's what being a reporter is. And at the very least, I came to define it that way. And I went to college. I was the first in my family on either side to have gone to college. I really didn't particularly want to go, but I had hung around newspapers. I ran coffee at the Houston Press and some other things. And many of the reporters at that time, this is circa mid-1940s, did not have college educations, but almost to a person, they said to me, well, if you want to be a reporter in your time, if you're going to grow up to be a reporter, you better get yourself to college, because the time is coming when nobody will be able to get a job as a journalist who has not been to college.
Were you filled with any sort of idealism about this profession? Or?
Yes, I was overflowing with idealism. But in the way of idealism, it soon, particularly if you're a reporter, some of it soon gets kicked out of you. What you hope is you go through a lifetime and a career that not all of it gets kicked out of you.
And why should that be, that the idealism would be kicked out of a reporter? And in your case, when did you first have a premonition that this was going to be tough for an idealist?
Well, when I came out of the Marines, I have one of the shortest and least distinguished records in the whole history of the Marine Corps. But I graduated from college early. The Korean War was on, and volunteered in the Marines and went in. When I came out of the Marines, I started looking for a job. And to answer your question, when I first started looking for a job, I had worked at various jobs when I was in college. Wire services, worked at the local radio station, various odd jobs in journalism. But I was looking for a full-time, out-of-college job. And there was a slight recession on at the time, and I had a very, very hard time getting a job. And to answer your question, when did my idealism begin to wane just ever so slightly? It was my realization that it's a business. I hadn't really thought of a newspaper as a business. I thought of a newspaper as public service. I still think of it as public service. And in college, I was taught a public journal is a public trust, and definition of journal including radio and television stations. But that was the first of it. And then as I finally got a job as a reporter, and in a way it was, when I say it's the making of me, I don't mean it in any self-aggrandizing way, but I covered the police station after midnight on Saturday night, the emergency room at Jeff Davis Hospital, which was our charity hospital, after midnight. I began covering City Hall and the local courts and began to see the things that existed then, possibly in a smaller supply than today, but you ran very quickly into the difference between those who had the money to go to pay for a hospital and those who went to the charity hospital. You saw the reality of the police stations, as I say, in the wee hours of the morning, saw corruption at City Hall and the county courthouse, and your idealism is put to the test. I want to emphasize I've never lost my idealism, but it gets chipped and cracked along the way.
Well, when you went to CBS in, it was 1962, was
Yes.
it? I mean, that was sort of the heyday of this really immensely respected gold-plated media outlet. Did you feel proud to be part of that, or what?
Very proud. I couldn't have been prouder.
And what made you proud?
Well, first of all, I was proud to be working at the same place with names such as Edward R. Murrow and Eric Sevareid, Charles Collingwood, the whole pantheon of electronic journalist greats. I was proud to be there because of the names of the people who were, some of whom were still there. Sevareid and Collingwood were still there. Murrow, whom I'd met earlier, had just left. I was proud of that. I was proud of the history and tradition of CBS News.
And did others also feel dignified by their jobs in television?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
When I came to CBS in 1962, I don't know of anybody who worked for CBS News who wasn't not just proud, but very proud to be there. A lot of that was built on the foundation of the patron saint of electronic journalism, Ed Murrow. But we were all very proud to be there. The closest I could come to it, and I'm keeping in mind my wife reminds me not to use sports metaphors so much, but, you know, ball players say when you walk in the New York Yankee clubhouse, there's a different feel. And because of the history, because of the tradition, because of the standard of excellence, that's as close as I can come. But I felt very proud to be there. I was humbled almost immediately because I had been a reporter in one form or another for 12 years when I got to CBS News. And I thought I was a pretty good reporter. In fact, I knew I was a pretty good reporter. And I thought I was a good writer, could write fast, write to deadline. Copy didn't need to be edited particularly heavily. But almost immediately when I got there, when I say I was humbled, I was really humbled because I realized what a fast track it was. You know, the first impression is, man, I'm walking the halls of icons and legends, people I've read about, in some cases I've been listening to on the radio since the 1930s. And the next thing is you look at their copy. And with me, I looked at the copy and said, whew, this is a bigger league than I thought it was. It's a swifter track than I ever imagined. And if I don't get better with my writing very quickly, and I won't say I was conceited about my writing, but I had the overconfidence of youth. And when I picked up a script that Charles Collingwood, a particularly gifted writer, or an Eric Sevareid, who is almost by acclamation the best writer electronic journalism has produced, and played in my mind how I would have written that, one thing that occurred to me is I probably ought to just quit and head back to the minor leagues. You know, Orville, I once asked a former Brooklyn Dodger catcher, Rube Walker, when I did play-by-play sports in addition to news when I was in Houston. He was on his way down, and he managed the Houston Buffs. And one day in a rainout, I asked him, I said, you know, Mr. Walker, what's the biggest difference between the minor leagues and the big leagues? He didn't miss a beat. He said, curveballs and per diem. Well, there's a version of that when you stepped in, but that's the way I felt when I came to CBS News, and it was just a matter of days, it wasn't even a week, when I realized, as I say, that the track was much faster than I had imagined, and that I was going to have to improve greatly in a very short amount of time if I was to stick.
Now, you know, in the intervening years, obviously television has changed immensely. If you were to jump forward now and describe sort of on the Richter scale of dignity in television news, where would you place us in relationship to when you came into this game?
Well, I sometimes say now, only fairly the last 4 or 5 years, partly as humor, there is no dignity in television.
Only partly as humor? Or
Humor. No, there is some. But I think the biggest difference is that the sense of public service and that network broadcasts are, yes, there to enhance stockholder value, yes, there to make a profit, yes, to get ratings, yes, to get demographics, all of which have been a fact of commercial broadcasting life for the length and breadth of time I've been in it. But there was, certainly when I first came to CBS News, and consistently through the years, while there may have been a slow diminution of it, there's been an acceleration in recent years of, listen, public service was yesterday. This is today. This is a business. And we must do better this half year, if not this quarter, than we did last, in both what we produce in the way of profits, ratings, demographics, all of those things. So I think the biggest difference is the flame of public service is flickering and burning very low.
and what effect does that have on people like you in your reporting?
Well, the biggest effect it has is that you, at least momentarily, will think about what you're doing in ways that you didn't before. An example would be if you're a 60 Minutes correspondent, which I am now. Same thing applied when I was managing editor of the Evening News. Now, you say, here's a story that we should be doing. Here's a story we think is important. Here's a story we think that people need to know about. I wish it were not true, but it is true that right away you begin thinking, well, yes, that's an important story, but in no particular order. What will it cost to get it? What's the potential of increasing the ratings? And much more important now than it was even 10 years ago, does it have any potential to attract viewers 18 to 35, which is the preferred demographic?
And isn't the answer, paradoxically, to that usually very little possibility?
Yes.
Which raises the question of then, why is it asked?
It's a good question, and here's the reason. The answer is yes. That there's very little possibility that you're going to increase the demographic. By the way, let me note at the bottom of the page, asterisk at the bottom of the page, there are other views, but I'm giving you mine, that the preferred demographic, by and large, is not available to the kind of news programs we do, particularly to the evening news. But I would say, even with 60 Minutes, perhaps they won't appreciate my saying this, but 60 Minutes continues to do at least reasonably well in the ratings. It's frequently a top 10 broadcast, of which we're proud, the only weekly news magazine that consistently gets into the top 10 in ratings. But if you look at what it does with demographics, it's much lower down on the scale. Frequently finishes in the 40s, for example, if you list programs by demographics.
Or higher up the scale, depending on how you look at it.
How you read it. But even at 60 Minutes, which I'm very proud to work there, and it's in my opinion, the only one of the regular primetime news magazines that does its best to hold to a high sense of public service. It does do investigative reports. It does put segments on the air which everybody agrees, listen, this is not going to draw people to the set. In fact, it may chase them away. And no, it won't help us demographically, no chance, but it's an important story, we're going to do it. But even in 60 Minutes, the so-called, and I think with reason, crown jewel of CBS News today, these things are very big factors, and they become bigger factors as the weeks and months go by. Now, back to what we're describing, what's the difference? When I first came to CBS News, I can't say I never heard of the ratings, but for at least 10 years, I never heard the ratings discussed at CBS News. From 1962 until at least 1972, I never heard them discussed. Now, it's true, I was a line reporter, and I was not always in a position to hear it, but ratings were not a major factor.
But it was true at that point that no news division was expected to make money.
That's
Basically,
correct.
it was a loss leader. It was
That's
a
correct.
prestige, and that changed as a result of 60 Minutes, largely, when 60 Minutes amazingly started making money, and the suits began to say, what?
Well, that is the history of it. I would add one thing, what you're saying before, we were a loss leader and added prestige to the network. But there was, from the very top of the network, in the form of the person who owned the network, William S. Paley, there was a high sense of public service. Yes, they wanted the prestige. Yes, it was a loss leader. Yes, it helped some with the FCC. But I'm not patting my part here. I knew Mr. Paley, and he certainly was interested in making money. He certainly was interested in getting ratings. But he had a strong sense of news as a public service and as a duty, as an obligation, as a citizen, and a citizen with a powerful voice, if you will. That was a strong sense. But your history is correct that 60 Minutes came on the air 1968, I think. It was moved around the schedule. It did not do well in the ratings, but nobody worried a bunch about the ratings. And when it was moved to 7 o'clock, it was at 6 o'clock in the Eastern Time Zone when it started. Not sure when it started, but that was its basic time period. And in the period 1975, the decision was made to move it to 7 o'clock. It's too long and boring a story as to why it was moved to 7 o'clock. But the leaders of 60 Minutes did not want it, Don Hewitt and others, did not want it moved from 6 o'clock. Not that it was burning up the league at 6 o'clock, but the belief, whether it was true or not, the belief was that the powers that be at the network, the programmers at the network at the time, wanted to move it to 7 o'clock because they wanted to kill it. They thought you move it into prime time or close to prime time, it's going to be competing against entertainment programs, it won't make it, and we'll finally be rid of this damn thing, get it off the schedule. Now, whether that was true or not, I don't know, but the belief was strong in 60 Minutes, and that's one reason that the move in time period was resisted by the people in 60 Minutes at the time. But lo and behold, when they moved it to 7 o'clock in late 1975, when I joined the broadcast, it took off like a big rocket. It was the right time, right program, and for whatever reasons, its ratings began to climb, and through very late 75 through 76, the ratings began to climb, and by 77, the network had a hit on its hands. Lo and behold, a network news program that's a hit in the ratings in prime time was something new. No one had ever seen that before because it had never happened before. The great Ed Murrow programs, See It Now, CBS Reports, did reasonably well in the ratings, but no one called it a hit show. No one expected to go in the top 10. So when 60 Minutes got into the top 20, even the top 25, ratings began to climb. There began to be a fair amount of buzz about the program. Salesmen were coming in saying, listen, we don't have enough time on 60 Minutes. We've got people lined up around the block who want to be associated with the program. Then the powers that be at the network said, lo and behold, this damn thing not only gets the ratings, but it makes money, and it makes a lot of money. And it didn't take long before they thought, well, if we can make money off 60 Minutes, what is this business about news being a loss leader, being a prestige item, being part of public service, if you will? This now becomes a very important part of our primetime schedule. Not only keep in mind are the ratings for your program important, but it's very important that you deliver high ratings to the next program behind. Since 60 Minutes was doing well at 7 o'clock, if I haven't lost you here, when the entertainment people from the West Coast would put in a program at 8 o'clock, they had a built-in audience. And so it was a building block for Sunday night, and that added to its value. But perhaps we digress, that once they saw that they could make a lot of money out of 60 Minutes, they began thinking about, well, why can't we do this with other news programs? And other networks began to think the same. It wasn't immediate, but in a fairly short span of time, the old model of we're not in news to get ratings or to make a ton of money changed to 60 Minutes has shown that we can get ratings. At that time, demographics were not all that important. We can get high ratings and we can make a lot of money. And one network after another, basically in those days we had three, NBC, ABC, and CBS, all tried to build around that model and eventually began to try to make their whole news divisions.
So that was a kind of fatal success, in a way, to the notion of public service, and that there should be some part of the networks that are not necessarily profit centers.
Well, you know, I still work at CBS, and I'm very loyal to CBS. I would prefer to say it was a deeply wounding success.
All right, that's fair enough. How is it that, now, of course, the cable channels are not owned by the public, but the wireless channels are owned by all of us. They're worth hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars for a television channel, and yet to get a license for one, it's a few $100. You fill out a card to get a renewal and send it into the FCC. Right. How did it happen that these public thoroughfares, if you will, became the property of private companies which did not have a particularly highly evolved notion of public responsibility or public interest?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm qualified to answer that question beyond giving you my opinion, which I think it has to do with power, influence, and money.
Well, that says it all for me. Yes. Well, moving right along, you know, I did want to ask you, I know this is a topic that you were endlessly questioned on, but you have had a very sort of sometimes adversarial relation with presidents. And I wanted to ask you what you view the role of a reporter in regard to a president. Is it as a watchdog? Is it as a transcriber of what they say? Is it what? How did you see yourself?
Well, some of all of the above. Number one, widely believed, it may not be, but true it is, that you never met anybody who had more respect for the American presidency than I do. And as a consequence of that, I have great respect for presidents, whomever they may be. For one thing, I was raised by people who had that view of the presidency. Remember, I was born during the Depression, and most of my early youth was during the Franklin Roosevelt years and the war years. But I have great respect for the presidency. I was the White House correspondent for 10 years. Those years were not consecutive because I was posted overseas, including the Vietnam War for a while, but in total for almost 10 years as White House correspondent. And as corny as it may sound, it is true that I never walked through the gates of the White House without feeling a very strong sense of pride that I was a CBS News correspondent, White House correspondent, but more than that, really humbled to be there and felt a responsibility and, if you will, a duty to be an independent journalist. I wanted full respect for the presidency, particularly, and I think this is point, Orville, that I find that many people, even those with a pretty good education, either don't know or underestimate. When you address an American president, as a reporter or anybody else, as a reporter, when you're questioning a president, one is aware, at least I'm very much aware, that our presidents are not only head of government, but they're head of state. And that's an important difference. For example, sometimes I get into debates with my British journalist friends who say, well, you know, we question the Prime Minister more often and tougher than you guys do the President of the United States. Well, number one, I'm not sure that's true. But even if it is true, yes, they question the Prime Minister that way, but they do not question the Queen that way. The Queen is head of state, the Prime Minister is head of government. They have a different system. But in answer to your question, I think the role of the White House correspondent is to be an honest broker of information for the viewer and listener. Having said that, I have great respect for every president and tremendous respect for the office, that when a reporter rises to ask a question of a president, any president, whatever party, our presidents are not descendants of sun gods. They are citizens who have been honored with the most important responsibility in the country. But it's citizen to citizen. I always viewed it that way. I recognize that there are people who have other views, and I respect that. But my view was a citizen was rising to question another citizen, the president, with respect, and try to get information that would be important to viewers and listeners. And I did view it as an honest broker of information, and I had a strong sense of wanting to be independent, fiercely so when necessary. Perhaps I had too heavy a dose of that, but without apology, I'd rather have too much of it than too little.
But Dan, what's the, I mean, you speak of respecting the office, which is understandable, but what happens to someone such as yourself when you don't respect the man, or when you think the president is spinning something or possibly even lying?
Well, first of all, that, and I recognize particularly with more modern journalism, that the word objectivity has gone out of fashion. But insofar as it's humanly possible, I want to be an objective reporter, which is whatever I think of the man, whether I think he's a good man, a bad man, or whatever I think of the man, I try very hard to put that out of my mind. And I think one mark of a pro is how often you can set aside your own biases, your own prejudices, your own opinions, particularly of this sort. Okay, I like this guy, I don't like this guy. As a pro, you say to yourself, listen, that does not matter. What you think of him doesn't matter. And insofar as it's humanly possible, set that aside. That's the way I viewed it. Now, when you believe that the president and or his operatives are spinning, you need, and I'll recognize that this is a family broadcast, if you will, when your spin detector begins to hit against the post.
Which is not uncommon these days, is it?
Well, in my judgment, it's against the post most of the time. But, no, that, you know, that's when, I think that's when you show your character as a reporter. That your job as a reporter is to cut through the spin. And at the White House, and not because I know everything about covering the White House, but you can't be there 10 years and not feel you learned something. When I talk to younger reporters, and let's face it, they're all younger these days, about covering the White House, I say, you know, your job is to, yes, go to the briefings, and yes, listen to what's said and what's handed out to you. But you must not become a conveyor belt for that.
But then you get denied access.
Yes, and that was mentioned earlier. And I wonder how many people realize, I don't mean this in a patronizing way, how much that now influences coverage. And it goes this way. There's always been a version of this. It was before I began covering the White House, before I came to CBS, but the point is it's grown with each successive presidency, Democrat and Republican, that if you are not a good boy or girl, if you try to cut through the spin, if you try to speak truth to power, speak the people's truth to power, ask the questions that people want, you will find that your access is cut off, and it may be cut off permanently. And particularly if you're in television, this is true of any reporter, but particularly in television, this can be harmful to your career. Because providing access, besides the fact that getting access to the principal decision makers and people who know is important to your general work as a reporter, your ability to get access, if you can't get access, your boss is very likely to be saying, you know, Joe's a pretty good White House reporter, I admire his spirit, I like the fact that he's tough-minded, but our competition is killing us with interviews with key aides at the White House, with the First Lady. Let me say, this goes through Democratic and Republican administration. My point is, it's gotten worse, if you will, each time. We've kind of gotten off on access. But don't underestimate the pressure to provide access, to get access, and the corrosive effect that has on a reporter. Being a White House reporter, I don't know of any journalistic enterprise that is considered a prize post. You get there, it's a promotion, and you want to keep it. And even the best among us, and I do not exclude myself from this criticism, the access game, and what's happened is the politicians have found out that the access gives them increased leverage on you to either report it their way or make sure that you don't report anything that they consider to be negative. But there are many other aspects to this besides access. The point is that access has become access journalism.
As a currency.
Is a phrase that didn't exist, so far as I know, 10, 12 years ago, maybe not even 5 years ago. It exists now because it's part of the reality.
Now, you didn't have great access to the current Bush White House, even before your story on Bush's tenure in the National Guard. But what went through your head as you were contemplating that story? And I mean, this was a story that could have, if it had turned out differently, perhaps changed the election.
Well, I didn't think of it that way. That did not go through my head.
But how could it not have? I mean, it's just before an election.
Well, it's very important for me that you know that I'm not the vice president in charge of excuses. And there are no excuses. And I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but I will say that it is not an excuse, but it's a fact that I went straight from the Republican convention to cover a major hurricane in Florida. And we had discussed this story before as a possible story. But to say I was busy with other things is not an excuse. But you say, well, how could you not have thought of it? I didn't really think about much of it, and for that I'm accountable. And I should have thought more about it, but I didn't. And things moved very quickly. But whether anyone wants to believe it or not, I didn't think of it in those terms. The question was, is this a story? Does it have new information? Is the information important or potentially important to the audience? And very quickly, you can argue whether I should have or not. I said yes, 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 on all counts of that.
I mean, a question I think everybody has about that story is that maybe in the end the documents could not be proven in terms of their provenance. But the question that never seemed to get explored or asked above that was, is the story true?
Well, I think that's a good question.
And can we discuss it a little?
No.
I mean, I mean, do you think people just got scared off it at that point? It blew up so badly that it just was something no one wanted to touch?
Well, first, the question you ask, I do think it's a good question. I think it's for each person to decide for his or herself, looking what we did on the air, whether they believe the story to be true or not. But Orville, let me pause and say that I do subscribe to the notion there are no bad questions, there are only bad answers. Mm-hmm. And on this subject, basically what I have to say, I've spoken a lot about it over time. I put it behind me as best I can figure out. Most people have put it behind them. If and when any new information comes forward, which is a possibility, but I don't know that it will, it'll contribute to history's perspective. And history will have the final say on whether we should have done the story, whether we did the story right or not, whether the story was true or not, and I'll live with that and accept that. And beyond that, I respect that you'll want to ask some questions. I probably won't have very good answers.
Well, I respect that. I mean, in a certain sense, this was also a real coming out party for the internet as a kind of an acid bath to test the mainstream media, and you did end up being sort of the poster child for that interaction. What did you learn about the internet? I mean, as you look back on it now, did you feel you were adequately apprised of what was going on in that parallel universe, or how are these two universes going to connect in the
No,
future?
I wasn't, but I have the heavy responsibility for that. I'm not blaming somebody else for that. But what we were, well, let me speak for myself, but I do think that it was widely, I know that it was widely shared in the network. We were well behind the curve on where the internet and what's now called blogging, it was called blogging then, where it was and what its potential was for affecting events and affecting public opinion. We were well behind it. And the panel that was selected by the corporation to run this Viacom Corporation investigation into this matter, it was their conclusion, I'm quoting them not directly, but I think I know accurately, that if we had handled the period beginning no later when the broadcast first went on the air, and particularly in the first week or 10 days, if CBS News, including myself, had handled that differently, said the panel, these are not my words, theirs, then probably no investigation would ever have been necessary. It was a line of saying that we handled the aftermath of the broadcast very poorly. That was their judgment. Now, where that fits into your question is that I had no idea, I should be, and I'm a bit ashamed of myself for having to say this, but I had no idea of the power of the internet, and particularly the bloggers, not all of whom, but some of whom have a partisan political and or ideological agenda, and that politicians were ahead of me and ahead of CBS News, and politicians of both parties, but that includes the administration in power. They knew better than we knew what the power to influence public opinion was on the internet and with bloggers. And I agree with the panel that that whole period, that is the period beginning after the broadcast.
Those few days before you...
Yeah, and that the decisions made at that time, in retrospect, there were a lot of bad decisions made about how we handled the criticism, both criticism we considered legitimate or potentially legitimate, and the criticism that we felt was coming from orchestrated partisan, political, or ideological forces. How
I
we
mean, it was
handled all of it.
incredibly vitriolic. And I wonder, where do you think that sense of, I mean, where does that derive from? What do you think is going on when people out on the you know, blogging and the web are so hostile to the mainstream media, or the MSM as they call it, and to people like you, reporters, who are just doing your job as you've always done?
Well, there's several parts of that question. That first, let me address what you said toward me. That I think by any objective analysis, in no particular order, number one, I worked for CBS News. And CBS News has a history and a tradition. That if you saw the movie Good Night and Good Luck, in which the rightfully legendary Edward R. Murrow asked tough questions about Senator Joseph McCarthy, if there is a line running through American politics, for that matter, culture politics, that CBS News has this history of taking on Joe McCarthy. Early on in the civil rights movement, CBS News covered the civil rights movement earlier and much more than competitors at the time, the civil rights movement.
Do you think CBS could take on a Joe McCarthy today?
I would hope so.
But
I don't mean that as money. I would hope so. But I will say it would be much more difficult today. Much more difficult today. Because what may have been missed in the film, and I'm sorry for anyone who hasn't seen the film, but...
You enjoyed the film and found it an accurate or reasonably...
I was amazed at how authentic it was, not just in the facts and the storytelling, which it was, but in such small things as they got the newsroom and the control room exactly right, which amazed me. It's the most, I think it's the most authentic depiction of a newsroom and control room that's ever been put on the big screen. But nonetheless, there's a line running. I work at CBS News, and proudly so, and always have been proud so. But there are some people, there are some parts of the American body politic, some part of the ideological spectrum that has seen CBS News from before when I got there, but including some of the time I've been there, as, if not anti-American, anti to their beliefs of what the country should be and how the country should go. So,
Do you think that's gotten worse, or?
I think it's gotten worse.
Yeah.
The same thing, you know, I think the country is more divided now than it has been any time in my lifetime. And not just about on the subjects we're discussing here, but in general, the country is tremendously divided, and I'm worried about that. Back to the question. So we were early on to civil rights, and it's easy to forget now, and some people never knew, that there were very, very strong feelings about institutionalized segregation. A large amount of the American population believed in instituted segregation, that is, legally binding segregation. It took on a tough one. CBS News took on a tough one when it began covering civil rights and covering it very heavily, virtually franchising the story. Not everybody liked that. I won't take the full history. Then we go through Vietnam. We all know how divided the country became over Vietnam. And listen, CBS News hasn't always been the best at covering every story, but two of the stories that, by consensus, we got on early, poured resources in, and stayed with, and had the most distinguished coverage in television, were civil rights in Vietnam, two of the most controversial subjects of the day. And then we go on through the Watergate period, and the only president to resign in our history. It still kind of puts a lump in my throat to realize that he resigned as an unindicted co-conspirator, as the leader of a widespread criminal conspiracy. Again, CBS News, not me, but CBS News was for a long time, for quite a while, the only network news that got on the story and stayed on.
What's the story now that's the equivalent to those three stories historically that you're...
Well, there are a number of stories around now. So this line runs through. Let me finish for a second. Line runs through. And because I was at CBS News during this time, from beginning with the civil rights movement, and because I was on point as a correspondent, I'm perfectly happy to do so in another context, because being on television is extremely egocentric and narcissistic to a degree, but this is not about tooting my own horn here. But I was a line correspondent during the civil rights movement. I was our point correspondent in the early days of the civil rights movement. I was head of our Saigon Bureau through almost a year, practically a year in Vietnam in 1965-66. And I was the White House correspondent during the Watergate period. So you put those things together and you say, well, why is it that people can get vitriolic? While I don't agree with it, I do understand it. From their viewpoint, CBS News and, to a degree, Dan Rather, have contributed to a lot of what they see was bad and is bad in network coverage. Now, to your question, what's the equivalent today? I'm not sure we have an equivalent to the civil rights movement or the Vietnam War, at least not yet. But the Iraq War. There are many similarities with the Vietnam War.
Have we covered it well and courageously?
It has not been covered well, no. There are many courageous reporters, including many at CBS News and every network. My friend Bob Woodruff is still recovering from his wounds. John Burns, who's the New York Times correspondent, hero in my eyes, done terrific work and courageous work. There has been courageous work done by individual reporters, and there's been some courageous work done by television programs and networks. But the core question is, has it been covered well? And the answer is no. And particularly during the period to the run-up to the war, and I do not exclude myself from this criticism. The performance of the American press in general during the period where the build-up to the war and the run-up to the war was not good, bordering on the abysmal.
And did you have premonitions at the time that something was missing, or what was your own state of mind running up to the war?
Well, I didn't have premonition. I'm not very much of a premonition guy. And I fault myself for this, there were the kind of tugs that should be on a reporter about, boy, this is really moving fast. We're not asking enough tough questions, not nearly enough tough questions. I can be criticized, I have been, and some of it's justified, of sometimes asking too tough of questions. But again, I'd rather ask them too tough than not tough enough. But yes, there were these tugs. And when I look back on it, at the time I thought, well, gosh, I mean, somebody ought to be asking more questions about this. Well, right quickly you get, well, okay, Dan, somebody, well, what about you? And I do believe in personal responsibility and accountability in this. But again, this is not an excuse, but it needs to be remembered that
maybe you should answer your question, yeah. What about you? Now, why not you? Would the network not accept it? Were you, I mean...
Well, I'm loath to admit this, but fear is a big factor. And whether anybody wants to accept it or not, and there are other opinions, but in one way or another, fear is a major factor in every newsroom in the country today, and particularly during that period. And, well, I'll give you an example, and it's a big example, and it comes back to your question about why wasn't more done? Why didn't you do more? Why didn't I do more? Why didn't the press in general do more? One is the fear of being called unpatriotic. We were in the wake of 9/11. Nearly 3,000 of our people got killed in the space of an hour and a half on one day. The country had never been anything through this before. Again, none of this is by way of excuse, but you say, well, why weren't more tough questions asked? Why didn't you ask more questions? Part of it is a fear that if you ask the tough question, and tough questions were going out of fashion in journalism before 9/11. So we can't just say, well, it was only 9/11 in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. It was going out of fashion well before that. But it really came into fashion just because fear, if you even appear to be questioning the commander-in-chief, that very quickly you're going to find on the internet, on blogs, on cable television, in what sometimes pass for, quote, news programs, which are basically blather, you're going to find that they will hang a sign around your neck, unpatriotic, doesn't love his country, doesn't support troops. And that fear is real. And I do think, I know with myself, and I believe it to be true with a lot of other journalists, whether they want to acknowledge it or not, that not always in a conscious way, but thought was, gosh, the country's in this terrible period. We're in what the president's called a twilight war against, I think he called it, somebody, a twilight war against terrorism. It may last 10, 15, 20 years. And it's time to give them the benefit of the doubt. But don't underestimate that fear of being tagged unpatriotic. Now, in one's better moments, one knows the definition of a patriotic journalist is just the opposite of what I've described. That the patriotic journalist, particularly when the country is in peril, particularly when it's a critical moment, that's when your patriotism should show the most. And the kind of patriotism that says, listen, our job, our duty, our responsibility is to ask the tough questions, to have the people speak truth to power. And not only ask the tough questions, but keep on asking tough questions. Frequently what happens, somebody will finally suck it up and get on their feet and ask a tough question. And there's at least mentally a kind of gasp in the room of, okay, he or she is really laying it out there. And the person being questioned, whether it's the President or the Secretary of Defense or what have you, will slide off the question. And that's where it ends, instead of the next person on their feet being saying, you didn't answer her question. You didn't answer his question. Never mind the reporter who asked the question in the first place saying, forgive me, sir, Mr. President, or forgive me, sir, Mr. Secretary of Defense, but you didn't answer my question. We lost that during that period. And that would be the definition in my mind of a patriotic journalist who would say, okay, they can call me what they wish, call me whatever they're going to, and they will, but it's my job to get up and ask the tough question.
But might you not find yourself soon off the air, even though you were viewing yourself as patriotic?
I think there's a high possibility bordering on probability that that would be the case, and that feeds the fear. This is not worthy of us. I don't want anybody to think that I'm saying, well, you know, this is the way it is, and can you blame anybody for doing it? But you know, somehow, Orville, and I know you're aware of this, the sort of belief has gotten around that as a reporter, you need to be popular. You need to be loved. Well, in journalism, if you need to be loved, get a dog. Because you can't do the job. You can't fulfill your responsibility to public service if you're walking around all of the time saying you want to be liked. Now, particularly for someone in television, there's a version of this in radio, certainly, and even a version of it in print, that it isn't just walking out every morning saying, I'm going to see how many people I can get to dislike me. And on television, there's this fine, very difficult line of you need to get people to tune in. And you do want to be popular in that sense. You want people to tune to your program. Now, in your best days, you say, yes, and the best way to do that is to be a good journalist, to do your job, put aside your fears, you know, have some guts. And when you do that, they will come.
Do you think Murrow had the same kind of fear you're describing as sort of aloft in the land now? Or do you think he felt that he would, I mean, Paley did support him.
Reluctantly, but he did.
He did.
Yes.
But now, I mean, I think one may decide to be patriotic, one may decide one doesn't want to be loved, or doesn't have to be loved, and one's going to do one's job, but one may find they don't have a job.
Be out of work pretty quickly, perhaps.
Yeah.
Well, we know because of the research that's been done, Murrow worried about it a lot. And when a member of Senator McCarthy's staff suggested to a member of Murrow's staff that they, quote, had something on Murrow, that Murrow worried a lot, that what they had on him was that he had done really admirable work for what would now be called a do-good organization before he came to CBS News. And they had a lot of contacts with known communists at the time. And Murrow was, I started to use the word terrified, but he was afraid of this. The fear worked on him as well. But what made Murrow great was that he was able to overcome his fears and fight his fears. He worried about it before he did the McCarthy broadcast. He worried about it after the McCarthy broadcast. I believe it to be true. It may not be confirmable as truth, that Murrow believed that See It Now went off the air after a decent interval because of the McCarthy broadcast, that he eventually lost his primetime broadcast.
But curiously, he maintained his reputation and his place in sort of journalistic history.
Well, not only maintained his reputation, but ensured himself a place in the Pantheon, in the lead place in the Pantheon. And yes, I think there's a lesson there. But let us not forget, having said that William S. Paley reluctantly supported Murrow, that Murrow was a fearless reporter. And it took a fearless reporter to do the kind of work he did, particularly with the McCarthy broadcast, with Harvest with Shame, perhaps the greatest news documentary ever done. But that Murrow could not have done it without Paley. Now, Paley did want to make money, all the things we said before. He did want the network to be popular. But because he believed in Murrow, and also because he had a personal relationship with Murrow, and Murrow had access to Paley. Murrow got to make his arguments. We have to do this program. Paley, in effect, said, oh, God, Ed, not again. Nothing but trouble here. I mean, can't you do something else? Do something on poor people. Do something on starving people in Africa. But for God's sakes, don't take on Joe McCarthy here at or near the height of his power. But the point was that Murrow he saw Paley personally and made his arguments. And Paley was reluctant. He wished the whole thing would go away. But in the end, and this is the critical point which we may have missed in the movie if you didn't watch and listen carefully, it took the two of them. Without Paley, Murrow doesn't get the McCarthy broadcast on the air. True, without Murrow, Paley doesn't probably get it on the air either, because the kind of spine, the kind of guts that
Murrow had are always in very short supply.
But it took the two of them. You alluded to this in an earlier question. And the question for news consumers, for citizens of the country, where is there today, if anywhere, the ownership and leadership that can be combined with, if not a fearless reporter, at least one who may say, "Hoo boy, I don't like to do this, but I'm going to do it." Where does that exist?
Very scarce. I mean, I think you put your finger exactly on the question. It isn't simply that reporters are craven. Reporters need to be in a context where they're supported by the business side if they're going to have the confidence to do what I think most of them want to do.
Yes, and let's be fair here, as we always try to be, that I think many of us, particularly those of us who've been lucky and blessed and honored beyond comprehension by having jobs such as being the anchor and managing editor of a major network broadcast, when I include myself in this, we haven't worked hard enough to establish a relationship with the new ownership and leadership model. And I think people know this, but let's review that in Paley's time, the CBS that Paley owned and operated almost up to his death was fairly small compared to the ownership of the three major over-the-airways networks now. Viacom owns CBS. They just split the stock, which I don't understand, but that's another subject for another day. But basically, you have Viacom, GE, and Disney. Huge international conglomerates.
And huge food chains of command, so you can't
Exactly.
really get to the top.
That for a reporter, even for a Murrow, I mean, you know, Murrow is one of a kind. Severide wrote me when Murrow died that he is a shooting star. We are not likely to see his kind again soon, and we've never seen his kind again. But a wanting to do the right thing, major reporter at a network, that in those days it was the news division answering directly up to Paley. And then as CBS got a little larger, it was the network answering directly up to whomever was under Paley, Frank Stanton, somebody else. But there was a clear line of communication as well as command. And now, as you point out, there's layer after layer after layer. Again, I guess this is about the fourth time I've said it. None of this is by way of excuse. It's trying to have you understand what the difficulty is. And I fault myself, among others, of not working hard enough, realizing that it's harder now to get an audience with the ultimate decision maker, the owner of the huge international.
Who may not really understand the media or
No,
may
and
not cut his teeth
and
in
if
the
he
media.
did, that is, if you were able to get to this person, he might accept your argument. Point is, I don't know anybody who's made it to him. If you sat down, you know, I believe, and it's been a long time since anybody called me naive, that, you know, I think these large companies, these large corporations are owned by good and decent people. I think they're as patriotic as I am. I think they love the country as much as I do. I have a reason to believe they want as much, or perhaps more than I do, to do the right thing. But the point here is that in terms of news, it's rare when anybody gets an audience with them.
Did you ever ask to go see Sumner Redstone and make your case?
No, and I wish I had.
Well, never too late.
Well, never too late, but in a lot of ways, the hour goes late for me.
Well, maybe that gives you all the more prerogative to do it and reason to do it. Listen, I want to get to questions from you all, but let me just ask you the final question, which really was the subject of this whole exchange. Do you think the broadcast media is serving America well now?
I actually, knowing that this was the title of what we were supposed
Did
to
you
discuss here
prepare a
tonight,
10-page
I did
speech?
think about this a little bit. Well, in some ways, I think the answer is yes. I presume that's the answer you were looking for, but I think in some ways the answer is yes. In many important ways, no. But I would suggest that it's, with all respect, a bit of an oversimplification to deal with it in those terms, and this is what I mean. That what's happened in the country and how news people, newsmen and women behave, the standards they set for themselves, the standards they meet for themselves, is part of a larger picture. There's been a diminution of a sense of civic virtue in the country. And the reason I said with respect to that, I thought it's an oversimplification. Certainly journalism in general, and particularly television journalism, bears a heavy responsibility in that. And I do not think that we have met the responsibilities of our trust, public trust. Having said that, I think a network news program is a public trust in the same way that a newspaper in many important ways is a public trust. We haven't met that responsibility. But the larger picture is the whole idea of civic virtue has gone a bit out of fashion. For example, I can't see because of the lights, but I'd like to have a show of hands for the number of people who have written their congressman in the last month.
Well, here in Berkeley, Dan, you may be surprised.
Well, no, I was going to say, but that's fine. I knew that. And here in Berkeley, I expected more hands to be raised than might be elsewhere. But even in Berkeley, the majority of the people in the audience have not written their congresswoman or congressman or senator within the last month. So when you say, well, has television news failed the country? I think it's a much larger picture concern. Now, where we fit into that, and again, this is an explanation, not an excuse, that it's very easy when things go wrong. People want to blame somebody. And the press is always handy to blame. And one reason we're handy to blame, a lot of time we bear a large part of the responsibility for it. But we're asked to not only find the news, disseminate the news, but also make sure people pay attention to the news. In a way, we have to raise it, eat it, digest it all at once, and it's asking too much of the press. I want no ambiguity on this, that we have a lot to answer for, and I have a lot to answer for, particularly in the period of roll-up to the war. And then even after the war started and what's gone past it, while I think things have gotten a bit better, the press is, in general, is at least a wee bit less timid today than it was a year, or certainly 2 years ago. Now, if you wanted to conclude that it's because the president's approval ratings have gone down, I wouldn't necessarily subscribe to that view, but I would understand if you held it that way. But having said that, that American journalism, in my opinion, is in near desperate need of a spine transplant. That having said to you that the answer of what's failed in America, has it served the American people well, is just not quite broad enough a question for me. The whole business of we have to get back to basics, that we know what the country's about. This is a constitutional republic based on the principles of freedom and democracy. And its bedrock is it's a participatory democracy. That freedom and democracy, they are not spectator sports. And what's become popular is the population as a whole wants to be a spectator. Don't get involved, don't take position, or don't pay much attention. And then when things go wrong, say, you know what? The press didn't call attention to us for all these things. And I think that the major failing, having said the major failing is not having the guts to ask the tough questions and keep on asking the tough questions. There also is a matter of providing context, background, and perspective on news. That so much of American journalism, particularly television journalism, is focused on the big breaking story.
Well, it takes time and space, doesn't it?
It takes time and space, and particularly for international coverage, where we need the coverage the most, where the worst need is for international coverage, corresponds with the shrinking of the news hole for international coverage, whether you work at a newspaper or magazine or on television or even at the network level. And this plays into, are we serving the public well? And part of that responsibility, a large part of it's ours, having to do with the ownership and leadership as well as editors and reporters, but also with the public, because when I was anchor and managing editor of the Evening News, and we would have a big international story, take Sudan as an example. You said, we've got to cover things in Sudan. That budgets come into play there, but one of the things that you would get on that kind of story, and I use just one example, is, Dan, don't you understand that this is a new era? You don't want to be yesterday's man. You don't want to be a dinosaur. And people are not interested in international news, other than the war, of course the war. But other than the war, people are just not interested. And look here, we can show you the ratings. And this happens in one version or another, I think, in every newsroom. I can't speak for every newsroom. I believe that it happens less at CBS News than it does other places. Said, look, when you led the broadcast last week 3 days in a row with this international story, look where you were vis-a-vis your two major competitors who didn't lead with it. It is the belief runs strong among the decision makers that the public is not interested in international news. So it's one thing for me to say, we don't cover international news the way we should. We don't give it nearly enough time and space. But this is a shared responsibility, because nearly everybody gets it thrown back in their face sooner or later. Not only do we have the ratings that show that people are not interested, don't pay attention to international news, but when we go out and run these market research things, people go out, stand outside Walmart or Target, whatever, and ask people what they're interested in, they always put international news other than the war pretty far down the road. So this is, I come back to, somehow we have to get back to the base camp of it's a participatory democracy. And reporters such as myself have a high responsibility, have a special responsibility, but each individual citizen has a responsibility. And for those who ask the question, well, why didn't the press do more? I've tried to answer that in my own stumbling, kind of bumbling way here tonight. But the return question is, well, what did you do? Did you write your senator? Did you vote in the last election? Did you get active for whatever side of it you
Did
thought?
you write Andrew Hayward at CBS News and say, why aren't we seeing more X, Y, or Z?
Mr. Hayward is now retired.
I
but
understand that. Let's do a few questions. Time is moving on here. How would you compare major European and U.S. news networks in terms of power and money?
No comparison. As a broad generality, no comparison. American networks are larger, and even in the one or two cases where you could argue that perhaps the BBC is bigger or something, no comparison in terms of money. And now, I'm not talking about the money allocated to news, but the network as a whole, just no comparison, or very little.
What do you think of The Daily Show?
Love it. Love it.
Is that the answer to a better informed younger generation?
Well, it's part of the answer.
Yeah.
And one of the many things I admire about Jon Stewart and the Daily program, He says, and he means it, he says it privately and he says it publicly, he's not a journalist and he doesn't pretend to be. His is not a news program and he doesn't pretend it to be. It's a
Yet
comedy program.
he does manage to speak those unspoken thoughts which we all have.
Which is very valuable.
Yeah.
That's why I say I think the answer to your question is yes, that it contributes, and particularly with younger people, because they they watch the program. But I think it's a contribution, a great contribution.
Dan, let me ask you a kind of a strange question myself. Do you think you can speak your mind? Or do you find yourself censoring your thoughts because of various reasons? And,
No,
do you feel that you're on a one-to-one drive?
Of course I run, through my own hurdles of self-censorship. Mm-hmm. And when one appears in a forum such as this, and if I hadn't said before, I want to say now, I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to be on the same platform with you. And also, if you'll indulge me 1 second, I'm also honored to be in the presence of my old friend and a great American treasure, Walter Shorenstein, who's somewhere out there, and if you'll join me in...
Right here.
No, but of course I do, because rightly or wrongly, and sometimes I argue it one way and one another, that I subscribe to the idea that as a journalist, the first thing is the last. And, I'd like to think, I do think that my best work is still ahead of me, and I want to get to it. And so, the straight answer to your question is yes. You do go through sort of, your mental computer takes you through, be careful what you say about this, be careful how much you reveal. Of course it's true.
I am a UC student, and most of my friends get their news from the BBC as they see it to be more reputable. What do the British seem to do that makes them more legitimate?
Well, you're entitled, and I have no argument with your decision. But a lot of different people would have a different view of that. I respect the BBC tremendously. I was posted to London for 2 years in the 60s. I know a lot of people at the BBC. I admire it as an organization, as an institution. I admire the people who work for it, and I admire the job they do. However, my difficulty with the BBC, and my friends at the Beeb argue with me all the time, it's undeniable that the government has a say, BBC, and for all of our flaws, which are many, that the government is not a part owner and or operator of any American network. But, I won't argue with anybody who says the BBC does a good job. I think they do a good job. I can argue with this piece or that. But the question was, why do they seem more legitimate? Well, that's in the eye of the beholder and listener. I do know many people who say, Dan, I've seen you watching the BBC, I flipped over to it, I can't stand the thing. Somebody said to me recently, and I don't subscribe to this, but it's not an uncommon view, that the BBC tends to confuse being boring with being serious. Yeah. What's considered legitimate and credible to one person is considered less so to the next. It's a matter of choice, and thank God in free countries we have the choice.
Now, here's a question that says, you're well known for your colorful expressions. Can you share a few? Let me share a few. This race is shakier than cafeteria jello. He swept through like a tornado through a trailer park. Tell us about your affection for these ways of putting things.
Well, thank heaven for the question. It's a whole lot easier than the Bush story.
Yes. We're going to soften things up here at the end.
First of all, I grew up around people who use such a language. My father, who worked in a pipe gang, which means he dug ditches for a lot of his life, it's pretty boring work. And they were always looking for ways to say things in a different way. How many times can you say, he won or he lost, or he's ahead or he's behind, or he carried. So they talk this way. And when I went to work in the pipe gang for the first time when I was 14, for the summer, particularly there, they played these games during the day, different ways to say things. Okay, she's beautiful. Well, yes, but there's another way to say that. Well, she's so pretty that the pickup truck not only stops but backs up for her. That's another way to say it. So number one, I grew up around it. And it comes naturally to me. But when you're on the air for a long time with something like election night, clearly if you have a catastrophe, you can't go into this. But sometimes on election night, on election night 2000, I believe I was on the air for 6, 12, 15 hours consecutively. And the horse race aspect, which is not the only aspect to election night coverage, by the time you get to election night, that's what it's about. Early on, when I did the first election night in 1982, just after I'd come to the anchor chair, number one, I'd said to myself from the beginning, I can't succeed in this job if I try to be another Walter Cronkite. There's only one Walter Cronkite. What I'd better try to do is be the best Dan Rather I could be. So I said, I'm going to be in the air for a long time. I'm going to be myself. And some of these things just came out. And they got some attention. Not everybody liked them. I've worked for at least 3 presidents of CBS News who alternately would beg and threaten me to stop using them. But the other is that I think my hope was that it would add something to election night. You go hour after hour, and you've got 2 states hanging out. How many times can you say the same thing over and over? And sometimes stretch too far. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But the best I can say, if you'll pardon this grammar, that's me.
That's the
That's the way I
Texas come to
sometimes
New
talk.
York. Are you a liberal?
I'm
You've
an
certainly
American.
gotten pilloried for being a liberal.
I'm an American. I'm independent and fiercely so.
Throughout your career, what has been your most difficult challenge?
Good question, by the way. I like the question. I think the most difficult challenge is to find the courage to do the job the way you know it ought to be done, to meet your responsibilities, to the high standards you know ought to be kept. I think over the length and breadth of the career that's been the biggest challenge.
What in the last 10 years of U.S. history makes government complicity in the 9/11 inconceivable? Do you wish you hadn't said your commander-in-chief need only tell you where to stand?
Again, it's a good question, and I'm glad the question was asked. That I said that on the David Letterman program when I felt, for whatever reason, an enormous hammer to the heart of grief. I had no apology for it at the time, and I have no apology for it now. That we were in the immediate days following 9/11. The country was at a critical moment in great peril, and I want to make it clear that I wanted to do my duty as a citizen, not just setting my journalistic hat off. On the Letterman program, I had my journalistic hat off. And you can't apologize for grief. And that was a moment of grief. It was not an opportune moment, but that's the way it is with grief. I tried to hold it in for a long time and had held it in for a long time. And it, for whatever reason, just a wave of it hit me then. But again, I want to make clear, I don't have any apology for having said it, because that's the way I felt at that moment. And in many ways, I feel that now. It's my version of, if the country needs me, whatever they need me for, I'm prepared to do it. It was in that spirit that I said it, and I don't apologize with it. I think the question, implicit in the question, was something about what makes me believe there wasn't some government conspiracy into it. I don't believe that. that's a different thing of saying, did the government do all it could have and should have done to prevent it? But you're talking about a conspiracy because there is, to my knowledge, no empirical evidence or eye or ear witness testimony that would support the conclusions that there was some government conspiracy to make it happen. I consider it bull feathers.
Let's end with two questions about Iraq. Why hasn't there been more coverage of whether Donald Rumsfeld should be held legally and morally responsible for torture?
Well, there has been some coverage. The question is, why hasn't there been more coverage? We could have a long discussion about journalism, but you know, the version of there's so many things to report in so little time. But there has been some reporting on that. And I give print a lot of credit. Some newspapers and magazines have dealt with it. The question is, why hasn't there been more? The answer is that there are a lot of stories to report, a lot of important stories to report, not just about the war, but what's happening in Darfur and Sudan, 2.5 million children going to bed starving at night. I mean, there's what's happening in Central and South America. There are a lot of big important stories, and everybody has their choice of where a program or an editor should place their emphasis. And as one who's had the daily responsibility of 24 years, I want to tell you that we do our best to sort it out and to place importance where we think we can. It's needed. I do agree that this is an ongoing, legitimate story. But back to the question, why hasn't there been more coverage? I hope I've answered it. I'll answer it best I can.
Well, this question may be slightly unfair because you are a journalist, not a politician, but if you were president, what would you now do with Iraq?
Well, that falls under the heading, and I'm pausing because I'm not sure, particularly in Northern California, that this will translate.
Well, try us.
That kind of question falls under the heading of if a frog had side pockets, he'd probably carry a handgun. Which means I'm not president. I'm not likely to become president. And therefore, you know, any thought about what I might or might not do to the president, it's not a frog. I don't have side pockets, and I don't carry a handgun, so I don't think it goes anywhere. What you're looking at is a reporter who got lucky, really lucky, that I have no illusions. How to command a war, how to settle on a strategy, much in tactics of the war, how to have an exit strategy, how to get out of what up to and including now in many ways, at least in many ways, has appeared to be a losing situation, is not something I'm qualified to say. On my best days, I hope I'm a half-decent reporter. I've been to Iraq, I think, 8 times in recent years since the war started. And when I'm there, I do my best to be an honest broker of information, tell you what I see, hear, feel, what we have pictures of, and that's about the best I can do, figuring out what to do about the war. Forgive my reporter's French, but damned if I know.
Well, join me in thanking Dan Rather for being here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.